Perhaps one of the most well-known instances of a president firing a notable general was the dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur by President Harry Truman on April 11, 1951. The dismissal occurred in the midst of the Korean War as a result of Truman's perceived disloyalty on the behalf of the general. MacArthur's firing engendered overwhelming criticism of Truman and would have serious repercussions on the president's popularity and political career. In determining what it was that made Truman's decision so controversial, though arguably so necessary, it's worthwhile to draw parallels between Truman's decision and one that Abraham Lincoln made in 1862. For President Truman was not the only one that had fired one of the country's most popular generals. On November 5, 1862, General George B. McClellan was relieved of his duties as General-in-Chief of the Union's Army, a decision that impacted President Lincoln in the course of the Civil War. This video will not be an analysis of the decisions these two presidents made to discern whether or not they were correct in their actions. That's difficult to say, and regardless, a decision needn't be labeled as either correct or incorrect necessarily. This video will be an analysis of the decisions these two presidents made in an effort to explain the complexities behind the dismissals and why they are historically relevant. President Truman's firing of General MacArthur marked the culmination of a series of animosities between the two leading figures of the country during the Korean War. MacArthur had long been disobeying or dismissing Truman's orders in regards to handling the overseas conflict, as the two had their own beliefs over the way the war should be dealt with. To provide some context for Truman's decision, a brief history of the Korean War should be explained. Towards the end of World War II, in 1945, the Korean peninsula divided to form North and South Korea. South Korea was an ally of the United States, but North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, would become a communist state, highly sympathetic to the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. In 1950, the Korean War officially started when North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel into non-communist South Korea. The United States came to South Korea's aid and sent American troops, as well as troops from the newly formed United Nations. Truman, having established the Truman Doctrine in 1948, was vehemently opposed to the spread of communism and pledged to help the country of South Korea.
Great responsibilities have been placed upon us by the swift movement of events. I am confident that the Congress will face these responsibilities squarely.
However, the president also did not want to turn this war in East Asia into World War III. There are reports that the Soviet Union had nuclear capabilities, and a war with North Korea could possibly provoke some of their dangerous allies. Truman wanted there to be a limited war, but MacArthur was approaching the conflict through a different lens. He thought the Americans should push the North Koreans all the way back to Pyongyang, and then even further still. He wanted the complete destruction of communist presence, meaning the possibility of a war with China. MacArthur's jingoism was concerning Truman, who had to balance between thinking like a general and thinking like a diplomat. What upset Truman the most was MacArthur's egoistic personality and the belief that only he could save the U.S., and not the small, bespectacled commoner from Missouri. MacArthur was insubordinate, such as the time when he denied Truman's request for a ceasefire by sending troops over the 38th parallel. The situation was a political and military quagmire, however. MacArthur was not merely an insubordinate, he was a popular one. His amphibious attack at the Battle of Incheon was one of the many examples of his military success, and millions of Americans would read about MacArthur's heroism in their newspapers every week. But alas, something had to be done. After meeting personally with MacArthur and deliberating with his cabinet for months, he made the decision to relieve him of his duties as general in the Korean War. MacArthur was brought back home and met with an even larger crowd than had met Eisenhower when the five-star general returned from the Second World War. Truman suffered a tremendous dip in his approval ratings, something that further cemented his unwillingness to run again in 1952. The most compelling aspect of the event in my eyes was the fact that Truman had turned to history to guide him in his decision-making. He looked at the 16th president as inspiration and asked, "How should I fire a general?" In March 1862, prospects were grim for President Lincoln and the Union forces. The country was still recovering from its defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run and struggling to suppress a Confederate rebellion that exposed several flaws in the military strength and prowess of the Union. The head of the Union's forces at the time was General George McClellan, a West Point graduate nicknamed the Young Napoleon, who was intent on defeating the Confederate forces and winning the war. Many had hope in this young general, including the president himself, but it would soon become apparent to Lincoln that he would need to go. Born into an affluent family in Philadelphia, McClellan had grown up a man with certain luxuries and comforts that caused him to be quite unsuited for the austere climate of the Civil War battlefields. He was popular among the soldiers, but despite his military ardor and pugnacious attitude, he struggled to win battles. The biggest flaw of his military strategy was his inaction. Plagued by an unfounded belief that General Robert E. Lee had more men than him, McClellan repeatedly would refuse to send in troops to fight off Lee and score decisive wins. His inaction was one of the most significant reasons for the long duration of the war, but that was not the only thing President Lincoln was critical of. McClellan was also insubordinate, and an appropriate example to compare General MacArthur to. Like the general of the Korean War, McClellan would disrespect and disobey the commander-in-chief countless times throughout their respective wars. When McClellan was named General-in-Chief of the Union Army by Lincoln, the greatest honor a president could bestow upon an aspiring general during a time of great conflict, McClellan retired to his chambers when Lincoln showed up at his house. He repeatedly insulted the president and his Secretary of State, William Seward, something that would continue on the battlefield when he disobeyed orders to attack General Lee's forces many times. Lincoln knew that McClellan was a serious problem, but he needed to be careful in dismissing the general. There would be a rebuke of Lincoln should he remove the popular general, and the president wanted to make sure that any consequences of McClellan's removal would not exceed the consequences of McClellan's staying. In September of 1862, he got what he needed, the Battle of Antietam. Although claimed as a Union victory in Northern newspapers, Lincoln recognized it as a military stalemate and a huge loss for McClellan. In the aftermath of the battle, McClellan failed to capture a retreating General Lee, something which would have been easily feasible had McClellan used the forces he had at hand. In response to McClellan's further inaction, Lincoln is quoted to have said, "If General McClellan isn't going to use his army, I'd like to borrow it for a time." On March 11, 1862, Lincoln removed McClellan as General-in-Chief, leaving him in command of only the Army of the Potomac, with the intention that McClellan would be free to devote all of his attention to the move on Richmond. Lincoln would formally dismiss the general on November 5, 1862. It would not be until 1864 that General Grant was promoted to lieutenant general and helped change the course of the Civil War several months after the Battle of Gettysburg. McClellan would run for president in 1864 against Lincoln, though many Americans recognized Lincoln's reasoning behind the decision and sided with their president. McClellan's firing was a difficult decision for Lincoln, but a successful one, and one that proved to help advance the Union through the conflict. It's clear to see why Truman looked back upon the lessons provided by President Lincoln on how to deal with a bellicose general. Though Truman's dismissal of MacArthur admittedly did not go as smoothly as Lincoln's might have, it still remains a valuable lesson in how a president should deal with these affairs. Presidents will always deal with difficult generals, such as more recently when President Obama felt he must accept the resignation of General McChrystal due to the growing discontent between the two. I think that these four men, 2 presidents and 2 generals, create 2 very interesting stories. It's not easy to fire someone who may be more popular than you, who may have grown up wealthier than you and who think that they are every bit better than you, yet Truman and Lincoln were forced to do it. There may be no need to determine whether their decisions were wholly correct, but there is some value in making sure that their decisions are analyzed and provide some sort of meaningful takeaway.